So we've heard a lot today about chaplaincy in various contexts, in the hospital, in the military, plural hybrid identities, how do we manage prayer, things like that. So I'm kind of representing the academic side of the house, you know, in that I am a Buddhist chaplain. I am currently practicing my chaplaincy. I am in CPE. My clinical site is this university, this very university. I have an office in the Wellness Center, and students get to come in and talk to me, or I go up to the cafeteria and I have lunch and I talk to them. And in the meantime, I'm also a PhD candidate at Claremont School of Theology, which means not only is chaplaincy my vocation, it is my research. It is the subject of my study. I'm in the Practical Theology program for spiritual care and counseling, which means not only will I get a thorough grounding in academia, but I will also do 4 units of CPE, which is designed to get you pretty far along your way towards board certification, which would be nice someday. So, but I'm here today, like Holly, to kind of show, don't tell. But unfortunately for an academic, telling is what we show. So bear with me a little bit. This is the results of research that I did last fall. I think some of you here in the room participated in this. How many of you let me interview you about spiritual care last October? 3, 4, 5, 6, so many of you. So this is the results of you coming and talking to me for half an hour to an hour, and letting me ask you really random general questions, and then what came out of all of that. So the title of the study is All Care Spiritual? I'm actually not going to get into the original research question. I will talk a little bit about methodology, the research question that I ended up with, and then the findings and some possible theological implications. Actually, I'm going to skip that. Okay. So the place where I conducted this research was here at University of the West. I talked to students who are either enrolled in the Master's of Divinity program or recently graduated from the program. So you can see many of the usual suspects in that lineup. Conducted 15 in-person or online interviews during the month of October last year. I had a good mix of male and female participants of various ages and ethnicities from all 3 of the basic Buddhist branches, Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, both monastic and lay people. And I asked each of these people in an interview ranging from about 23 minutes to an hour 4 main sets of questions in what is called a semi-structured interview. I asked them, what is care? Just in general, and then I asked for very concrete examples. I asked them, what is spiritual care? And again, for concrete examples. And then I asked them, is there, or what is, the difference between care and spiritual care? And that question kind of depended on how the conversation had gone so far. Had they already articulated some kind of a difference or not? Then there were demographic questions. And during this process, certain themes began to emerge. And one theme was of particular interest to me, which was that question, is all care spiritual? Some people thought yes, some people thought no, and they had rather distinct opinions about it. Some people didn't know, didn't care to answer the question, which is fine. But I chose 6 of the interviews, 3 from each side of the question, is all care spiritual? And kind of analyzed them to see how do the 2 sides of the coin kind of conceptualize the answer to that question. So I did this using something called grounded theory. Grounded theory is the most Buddhist of all social science research theories because it is the theory of no theory. Okay, it's very Zen in that sense. Grounded theory says that we collect our data, we ask our questions, we collect our data, we make our observations, And then we allow our theories to emerge from what is. We don't come up with a theory and then try to test it and see if it fits and model, make our data go into the little categories. We just ask our questions and then see what's there. So I did this using qualitative data. Qualitative data is basically what we call human experience, stories, interviews. You can do a qualitative analysis on poetry, if you want to. Doing qualitative data analysis, you turn something into text, or you can actually do this with images too. Images, music, but it's coded for certain themes, ideas, traits, views, and then the codes are compared to see what kind of patterns emerge. So if this all sounds very dry, well, it is kind of dry, but it's exciting because it helps, for me, as a way I know that my experience is being filtered by my own preconceived notions. So for me, qualitative data analysis is a way to get past my own preconceived notions. And that's very Buddhist to me, so I find that to be beautiful. And the data will tell you a story if you've done your job right. So I had an original research question when I started asking about care and spiritual care, and it turned out that my original hypothesis was just kind of dumb. My original question was, does it matter? And the answer was, no, it doesn't appear to matter. And so the data gave me this new question: is all care spiritual? And from the analysis, I was able to create a common framework of 3 recurring elements that are in relationship with each other, and a common emphasis on 3 of the 6 elements of care. So I'll show you a graphic in a minute that'll maybe make this more clear. And from the data, there emerged 2 theories that I have decided to call branch theory and root theory. These don't exist anywhere else, so don't go looking for them. But basically, they're the 2 separate answers to the question, is all care spiritual? And in branch theory, no, not all care is spiritual. And in the root theory, yes, all care is spiritual. We'll explain that. So here's the common elements that emerged when I asked people, what is care? Tell me about a time that you received care from someone else. What was that like? Tell me about a time when you gave care to someone else. What was that like? Why was that particularly effective? Why would you call it care? Why would you call it spiritual care? So these are the things that reoccurred. First of all, it's obviously a relationship between 2 or more people. There's a caregiver and a care seeker. The caregiver has some kind of an intention. They perform some sort of an action, and there's an outcome from that. The care seeker also has an intention. They perform various actions, and there's some kind of an outcome from that. And where these things overlap, where there's, to use the bad word, synchronicity, care can happen. Okay? Now, when I started asking them about spiritual care, 3 of these things became more important than the others. So when I asked about times in the lives of my interview subjects when they'd received spiritual care, when they'd given spiritual care, why was that successful? Why did that work? Why is that spiritual care? They tended to talk more about the motivation of the care seeker and how that motivation is strengthened by his or her spiritual formation, if you want to call it that. That's kind of the term that Christians like to use, religious spiritual formation. And the way the caregiver was skilled at discovering and meeting the needs of the care seeker based on what the care seeker was signaling. Okay? So the tools that they bring into the room during a hospital visit or when they're working with a soldier. Okay? And then the final one was actually that the care seeker recognizes that particular opportunity for care as a form of empowerment that helps him or her access their own spiritual resources. Okay. So those are the three elements that had particular emphasis when we were talking about spiritual care. Okay? And no, I did not ask them to define spiritual. I know that's a loaded word, and we can write books on the definition of spiritual. And when people ask me, what do you mean by spiritual? I said, whatever it means to you. Okay? So the two theories look something like this. In branch theory, spiritual care is one branch of a larger type of care. In root theory, spiritual care is where all care starts. And the further you get from the roots, the less likely it is to be spiritual care. Okay? So, the people who, I asked the question, what's the difference between care and spiritual care? Or maybe I asked, is there a difference between care and spiritual care? And they would say yes. Spiritual care is one type of care, it's a specialized branch of care, but it's different from physical, mental, emotional, medical type care. There was often a sort of subtle ranking in this, which I think would probably happen in the other care disciplines too, where spiritual care is kind of the best because it's concerned with the most ultimate needs of the person. But it's distinct. It's a distinct branch of care. So in root theory, I said, is there a difference? What is that difference? And people said no. All care comes from a common root that is itself a spiritual impulse. And that is the shared motivation to care for and just to connect with our fellow human beings. And what we consider spiritual care, kind of in mundane language, in the conventional sense, is just more in touch with that basic motivation to connect with and care for other people. So these had implications when I took them back to the framework. So in branch, people who ascribe to branch theory, that spiritual care is just one of many types of care, they talked about how there are many intentions for providing care, some of which can be completely transactional. I pay you money, you take care of me. I stop paying you money, you stop taking care of me. They talked about how very few things qualify as spiritual care. They were very, very limiting in their, it's like, is this spiritual care? No, that's not spiritual care. They had very high standards. And they generally perceived that few people were skillful enough to provide spiritual care. Few people were mature enough in their own religion or spirituality, trained enough, practiced enough to provide really true, good spiritual care. People who answered opposite, people who tended to think that all care is spiritual, saw the intention as coming from a very common human motivation. They talked a lot about what we all have in common, what connects us. They described many different kinds of actions that qualified as spiritual care. Everything from, just they brought me food after my loved one died. That was an act of spiritual care by their definition of it. And for the outcome, many people can provide spiritual care, even people who are otherwise untrained. They talked about receiving what they perceived, what to them was spiritually nourishing care from nurses and relatives and strangers who were not otherwise qualified, who were not chaplains, who were not clergy persons, who were not otherwise qualified as spiritual caregivers. Okay? So what do we do with this? I've done these interviews, I've got this information. It's led me to, come up with these two theories based on what everybody told me. What are the theological implications of this? If this is what it looks like on the ground for the people that I've interviewed, I'm not saying it looks like that for anybody else, but if this is what it looks like on the ground for the people I've interviewed, what are the theological implications of that? So what is, to use kind of a Buddhist turn of phrase, right care from that perspective? So if we consider various Buddhist paradigms like rebirth and karma, understanding suffering, understanding how enlightenment happens, which I've grossly simplified here because this presentation was originally given to a bunch of people who were not even religious studies scholars, let alone Buddhists. I realize there are problems with oversimplifying sometimes, but just bear with me because this came out of a cultural studies field research methods class. So I had to tailor to my audience of anthropologists and ethnologists, and none of whom were familiar with Buddhism. So if we consider the implications of this theology, we can look at different possible responses. And these are not necessarily deeply thought out theological arguments. It's just this might be possible. So if Buddhists believe that people are reborn through multiple lifetimes according to their karma, and that one's karma plays a large role in one's religion or belief system, for example, I was born in a Christian family. According to that karma, I really ought to have ended up Christian. Didn't work out that way, but I do have a lot of Christian influence. So, the pragmatic approach to religious pluralism allows chaplains to kind of step out of their own belief systems and into another. And, for this reason, proselytization and conversion just aren't really necessary. Sometimes they're even talked about as harmful. So here's another possible implication for theology. So the Four Noble Truths talk about suffering. These are Four Noble Truths. They're shared by the different Buddhist traditions. They're understood slightly differently in each. Some traditions also have the Bodhisattva path, the Mahayana, the Vajrayana. We talk about the Bodhisattva path. So what are some possible responses from that? Well, that gives chaplains particular insight into the causes and the practical means of alleviating suffering. It talks about compassion, the act of suffering with, as a primary virtue. And it recognizes the necessity of skillful means over the primacy of religious truth. Okay. So these are possible implications. Last one. So if our theology tells us that enlightenment, liberation, nirvana, whatever you want to call it, the goal of the Buddhist path, they tell us that's the goal. And in mundane terms, this could possibly mean freedom from all suffering and an ultimate state of bliss. I realize, again, I'm grossly oversimplifying. But that all people are capable of achieving this, except that they need to achieve it for themselves, then the response of a chaplain might be that this allows the chaplain to maintain hope in the face of a care seeker's pain. We've heard some stories today about very, very painful situations. Very painful. Possibility of suicide, deep trauma, death and dying, grief and suffering. But there is still some small bit of hope. And it also encourages chaplains to work to empower care seekers. Even if that care seeker isn't seeking what I'm seeking, I know that whatever it is they are seeking, I can't snap my fingers and make that happen. That's their path. Okay. So again, I apologize, grossly oversimplifying. So if we say that right care includes the acts of listening, being with, holding, cradling, empowering, understanding, seeing, supporting, and guiding, and this is what came out. These are the common acts of care that came out of the interviews. These are the actions that people described. And that the goal is, a little more happiness and a little less suffering, if at all possible. Then what does that mean for these two theories that we've come up with? So we've created our framework, we've come up with these two theories, we've thought about our theology a little bit. What does that mean? Well, the best I could come up with for branch theory is that it doesn't appear to outright contradict Buddhist teaching. I don't know. Maybe I don't know enough Buddhist teaching. On the other hand, root theory for me seems much more consonant with common human qualities such as the desire to be free from suffering and the ability to achieve enlightenment. So, if we consider root theory in relation to the theology that we've been talking about, we can possibly posit something like this. The Buddha was a human being, and all human beings can become Buddhas. This is particularly a strong thread in the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions. A Buddha has perfected the primary virtues of wisdom and compassion. All human beings have the seeds of compassion and wisdom within them, just waiting to be cultivated. A lot of the interview subjects talked about wisdom and compassion and skillful means in the context of care. That care is an expression of these virtues. So it comes from the same seeds that would lead a person to enlightenment. Therefore, all care is spiritual in nature. The more grounded in compassion and wisdom, the more spiritual the care becomes. Whether that care is being given by a chaplain, or a nurse, or an auto mechanic. Okay. The more grounded in wisdom and compassion, the more spiritual the care becomes, according to this theory. This is just an example of how it might be practiced. This is Robert Bogoda, Simple Guide to Life, talking about the practice of the Brahma Viharas and how they elevate human beings into a divine-like stature. They break the barriers that separate individuals and groups. They build bridges more solid than those constructed of stone and steel. So that brings me back to my research question. Is all care spiritual? I got two answers. These two answers are reflected in the practical experience, the on-the-ground experience of the people that I interviewed. So how could I possibly ask which one of them is more Buddhist? How could I even ask that? I mean, my interview subjects, they weren't all Buddhist by any means, but they're all at least conversant with Buddhist values. So it's this cycle of going out into the world, seeing what there is, theorizing from that, comparing it to what we've been taught for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and figuring out where we get. And that, I think, is one of the really interesting things that studying spiritual care in an academic context has a lot to offer. And of course there are ongoing questions. That's what keeps people trapped in the ivory tower. We just have more questions. Too many questions. So, I analyzed 6 interviews, but I did 15. So did all 15 fall under one of those theories? Possibly not. Do all Buddhist chaplains fall into one of those categories? Why? Maybe not. Do we find them in non-Buddhist chaplains? Are there chaplains and branch chaplains out there? I doubt it very much, but it would be interesting to ask. What leads someone to think one way rather than the other? How common are they? What are the implications? How can they be understood in light of our theology? And will different traditions interpret, understand, accept, or reject the two theories differently? So there's all sorts of fun questions, so I'll have a lot of work to do. So that's just an example of the kind of research that we can do in the academy. But the ground of all of that is the experience of chaplains like the chaplains who sat up here today and shared with us. So without those chaplains out there in the field, that totally would not have been possible. And that is absolutely worthless if it doesn't actually help some chaplain somewhere in the field alleviate someone's suffering, even for a tiny little bit. So, thank you very much.